All right, here we are again. After a week delay, was out of town last week, out in Colorado Springs, which was fantastic. Wonderful environment. Got a few miles in, running around the area. It was wonderful, but it was very busy at a conference out there, and welcome to another edition of Together We Write. My name is Chris Perzicki, Assistant Professor of English and Humanities at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay. In this ongoing, sporadically scheduled live streaming series, we cover any sort of topic regarding writing, the process of writing, and how to sort of witnessing how it happens as it happens. All right, in all of its messy glory. So, one of the things we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to make sure I've got like 1,000 windows open and it's driving me nuts. So I got to close some of these out. All right, so we've talked about a few things on this show regarding professional writing, and we're going to talk a little bit about some more technical writing. Um, and could do something a little bit more visual though, because what I like about technical writing is that it does, at least for me, it I like the more visual quality that it tends to have. You know, professional writing, we were talking about document design and all of that good stuff. Um, that's one thing, but when you're talking about technical writing, I usually find it's specific types, especially when you're talking about instructions. It's good to have a sort of visual, but think your IKEA instructions, right? However, there's also a couple of aspects of technical writing that I want to focus on a little bit today. It's a little bit different. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to open up my PowerPoint slide because this is what we're going to be primarily working on. Yeah, there are different tools to accomplish what we're about to embark on, but I'm going to use what's accessible, right? So here at UWGB, we are a Microsoft campus. So these are the tools that we rely on to get our work done. They're free for students to use. This is what we have license for. So other options might be Adobe Illustrator. I know Microsoft, when we're talking about process mapping, Microsoft has Visio, and there's all sorts of tools out there. But for what it's worth, we're going to focus on just using what's available, and we're going to stick with PowerPoint. I imagine we could do this with Word too, but I'm going to hold off on that for the time being. Let's see what we. Oops. All right. So let me take a step back real quick. So, in fact, when we are engaged in some form of technical writing, it's you don't want to start off right away writing about the subject matter. Say you're writing a set of instructions or standard operating procedures, any sort of direction, or a set of directions for an audience. I would never recommend just stepping in and then writing it from scratch. Like, how do I? Let's see, what's a good example? Let's see. I usually use games for these purposes. In class, I've used in workshops, I've used tic tac toe. So actually, let's just go ahead and use that example. All right. So let's say I want to talk about tic tac toe. First thing I want to do is start to sketch out I'm going to pull over my board real quick. 1 second. Let me untangle myself here. Preparation key, right? Okay, hold on 1 second. goodness, you'd think I'd never done this before. Well, only a few times so far. All right, so let's see if I can pull my board over here. I'm gonna see if I can. Let's see. Yeah, so we've got a little bit of a glare thing. Yes, we are polished and professional, right? Okay, let's. So here we have our, let's say we have our piece of paper here. And I'm going to, one of the things about creating a live stream like this is that sometimes you just gotta go. My tendency is to be try to be as perfectionist as possible and make things all polished. And but boy, I tell you, um, you sort of gotta you kind of have to give up on this at some point. So what I really need is a better camera or a wider camera at least. So we've got our, let's say we've got our storyboard here, right? Okay. And what do I mean by storyboard? So we've got our, one of these days I'm going to actually bring my other camera in. This would be a little bit easier. So we've got our storyboard. What do I mean by this? A storyboard is essentially a set of frames where you start to sketch out the actions that are taking place. Like, so what do you, as far as directions go, is it that you're actually giving directions on? That's kind of an important question to ask, right? Because you don't want to just go in saying, hey, you want to start to unpack what those actions are. What are the steps? What are the objects being used and manipulated? And, what sort of system are you creating? Technical writing is essentially presenting a complex system to another audience. I tend to presume that that audience is comprised of non-experts. So whether it is a financial report or a set of directions, you're still presenting an audience with directions on how to proceed, right? And so you're delivering a body of expert knowledge to those that may not, that will likely know, are unfamiliar with some aspect of the subject matter. Now they may be not uncertain about how to conduct a certain step, but may be familiar with, say, a type of software, but or they could be extremely familiar. Say they've just installed a particular tool. All right. Well, let's take tic tac toe as a system, right? We're all familiar with this XOOX, right? All right. So let's take this as an example of a complex system because it is, even though it's very familiar and it's everyday. How would you explain the process of playing tic tac toe to an unfamiliar audience? Well, let's say the first thing I would do is I would take my pen and I would let's see, draw two lines that way. Let's say I've got my poorly drawn, sure. So we've got our hand, we've got this. So now we've got our board, and then might have one person places an X, and then Oh, I don't know, this is really bad, but all right. So then this keeps going until, all right, you've got your three X's. All right, so we skipped a few steps there. So eh, the whole point of this is to start sketching out the different pieces and components, and it helps identify. When it's easier to visualize information, and then once that's visualized, you can better speak to it. Right. So, what is the action that's happening here? Well, first, draw two vertical lines. Right. Next, draw two horizontal lines. Right. All right, so you're just sort of sketching this out. This isn't really for any use other than helping to unpack. So now that we've got the board, so that we might say board 3x3 grid. And then first player draws X. So one of the questions that comes up then is, okay, who who goes first? How do we determine which player? So we also need two players. So this is another step that I've overlooked. You know, take your pen and paper or any writing surface, right? Okay, so it starts to look messy. It gets pretty ugly, but really, the what you're trying to do, however, is set up yourself with a as much information as possible, so you can clearly articulate the direction that you're trying to give. Right. So you want to make sure that you have all of your steps. And what's also important, however, is to be mindful of those steps that we sort of take for granted, especially for those of you who are experts in your field, right? So if I'm an expert tic tac toe player, we have there are just sort of assumptions. I think most of us, what I love about this example is that it is so common that we don't often think about it. In fact, most of us have not played a game of tic tac toe in ages, and even when we did, it was only because we were so bored, had nothing to do that we didn't had nothing else to do with our time. Um, I wouldn't. But it's a pretty remarkable little system in itself. Remarkable that it's global. It is very common every day. It also evokes themes, competition, us versus them, very distinct themes, certainly sophisticated enough to be subject to critique. So it's what I love about tic tac toe, or really any sort of simple. Another example I like to use is the marker, right? What is the process of using a marker? Hold body in hand, with other hand, remove cap, right? What makes these systems so complex is that there is enough variation and enough opportunity for, the introduction of obstacles. So, say, for example, how often do I walk into a classroom and that dry erase marker is dry as a bone, right? And so, based on my observation, I'm using the marker. I've done all of the steps, but hey, there's no ink in here. All right, these are the things like that we encounter. Like, okay, so for as an example, tic tac toe, using a dry erase marker, whatever, using a pen. These seem like silly examples, but once you start to unpack it, you start to realize that there are a lot of opportunities where if you had never played tic tac toe, you would never used a dry erase marker. What do you do when in certain situations? What do you do if you want to change things up a bit in the case of the game, right? So we start to storyboard. So let's take um, let's continue with this tic tac toe example. The next thing we're going to do after I've storyboarded, I've got some ideas. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and shift over here, and I'm just gonna stick with PowerPoint for a minute because why not? Can do everything in here. Could probably do everything in Word. Like I said, there are other tools to accomplish this, but we'll just stick with this because it's got a lot of pre-made functions in there already that are useful. All right, so let's say, all right, so we've got our title, and from my storyboard, I'm gonna start with the components. All right, so when we're starting to unpack something, this what I use is a little bit of design thinking to unpack this, and also a little bit of knowledge about game design. Game design is helpful because when it comes to deconstructing complex systems, it helps. Like if again, tic tac toe is an extremely simple example, but I've got a pile of games over here. So let's say if we take Uno, for example, what are some of the components? Some cards, and the cards have uh, certain qualities, certain structures attached to them, and the rules. Okay, so now the rules for Uno are what's a little bit more complicated. In fact, I believe the creator of Uno only recently uh, uh, clarified one of the most controversial rules is the um, compounding of draw fours and draw twos or something like that. Pretty interesting that we're still confused about those rules, but it does tell us that there are certain assumptions, or as they've been, house rules, for example, versus the hard and fast rules that are on paper, right? But we're going to start with the components, right? Components are the pieces, the physical parts of any given system, or at least the ones that we're going to be concerned with. Now, the trick to this is identifying what your scope is. Like, what is your scope of your system? So it's important to start with those the limits, right? So for tic tac toe, my limit is going to be the players themselves. I'm not going to worry too much about where the players are situated, where they're playing at. I'm really focusing mostly on the game and the form of input that's needed to play the game or engage in the system, right? I don't know if you can see this, but I'm also getting some sassy chats that I'm going to have to make sure that I remove at some point. Right. All right. So we've got components. So what do we have here? Going back to my storyboard, I've got two horizontal lines. Oops. Lines. Right. We've got X's and O's. There's I'm gonna have two players. Tic tac toe. We've got 6 types of components that we absolutely need: 2 horizontal lines, 2 vertical lines, X's and O's, which are our markers, 2 players, a writing utensil, and a writing surface. Pretty straightforward, not too difficult. So the next thing we want to do is start to unpack what are the steps? What are the procedures? So what's first? Let's see. We might say draw 2 horizontal lines. Draw 2 vertical lines that intersect. All right, I'm just gonna keep it at that too. All right, so keeping it simple. Say player 1, X places marker in space on. So you can, as I'm working through just these steps, like thinking about my storyboard, thinking about going back to these steps, I'm sort of revising some of these. Like, so if I'm saying, player 1, X places marker in space on grid, well, I should probably mention that this is creating a 3x3 grid. I'm still sketching, right? The storyboard was a visual sketch. This is a more verbal sketch, right? Player 2, O, places marker in another space on grid. Okay. Markers on grid until play results in till all spaces are filled and one of the following situations are met. 3 in a row. Draw. No one places 3. Okay. All right, so I've got a simple outline of how to play, call it tic-tac-toe, right? But there's some things missing here. Like, so whenever I'm conducting a workshop or doing something like this in class, as we start to collaborate, we start to, groups are playing tic-tac-toe and they're wondering why in the world that they paid money and dedicated time to doing such silly things in a organized semi-organized situation, right? The key is when people start to actually play together or collaborate and start to unpack a lot of these steps. All right, so we've got 2 horizontal lines, 2 vertical lines. That's great. Player X, how is player? So here we have the first sort of decision to make, right? How is player 1 determined? Again, starting to think about these steps a little bit more, starting to unpack all of the nuance, really, of even a simple game like tic-tac-toe or using a marker. It starts to help, so for example, I'm left-handed. How many of us lefties have come across directions that were uh, written for y'all right-handed people, right? For those of us who are, I can't remember the exact term, but who are slightly or semi-ambidextrous, where we write with one hand and use scissors with the other, Okay. Uh, throw with my right, catch with my right. Um, every only writing do I use my left. So it's I also wonder about people who use with mice. If there's anyone out there who uses a left-handed mouse, that would be interesting. All right, so you start to pick out these questions. All right, and these are the areas where you need to be mindful of, because as you're putting together your documentation, your any whatever set of directions, you're going to also want to complement that with a set of frequently asked questions to sort of address some of these, right? Very common in a lot of games anymore because they're so complex that and even no amount of playtesting will cover everything. So every once in a while you come across these sort of questions. All right, so player 0, player 2, O places marker in another space on grid. So I might start to say, let's see. All right, maybe I hold off on discussing strategy. So, for example, some of y'all heathens like to place the first player places their X on the, you know, like the middle, somewhere on the, should have an example here. Some of y'all like to place it in, the common space to place your first marker would be the center square. One of my favorites is always one of the corners. Until I discovered the center square back when I was knee high to a June bug, and I see some people who put them on the sides. That middle square along the sides just to mess with things. Who knows? Um, players continue placing, but how do you describe strategy? How do you describe common tactics and techniques for something? This is where we start to draw in that nuance and those differences between, in this case, players or users, right? So when we're starting to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, because when we're talking about technical writing, there's also going to be some use case and testing involved, and making sure that the instructions are clear enough. But for our purposes, we're going to start addressing some of these right now so we can start to think about them. Because it's never too early. Players continue placing markers on grid until all spaces are filled and one of end or one of the following situations are met. 3 in a row, because you can get 3 in a row before all the spaces are filled, that's for sure. Or when all the spaces are filled and there are no 3 markers in a row, you end in a draw, right? So this is one easy, low-hanging fruit here, finding where those end states are. So really what we're talking about with when it comes to technical writing is presenting a guide or direction or clarification about how to get from point A to an ideal end state, point B, right? Well, there's all sorts of points along the way, but you're trying to acquire that ideal state. For tic-tac-toe, that ideal state is uh, typically a winner, right? One of 2 players places 3 in a row. Maybe you've got a house rule in which, well, you have to win 3 in a row to be declared the winner. Who knows? Maybe you have certain house rules about how is the first player selected. Is it the younger? Is it the younger player? Is it we have a in some cases playing rock paper scissors to determine who goes first, right? So here's that's this is the short bit of it, right? So we'll just leave it at this because we're not going to spend a whole lot of time today going into a much further than this. What I do want to do, however, I'm going to it so I can fit it into everything. Just occurred to me that I have not done a bit on putting presentations together, which I will do soon because that's exactly what we're coming up to in our professional writing course. So we've got this. All right. So now, the real gist of this is to first. Okay, again, we're talking about storyboarding. So from our storyboarding, we started to put together a lists of components and steps so we can start to identify areas that would probably require more information, uh, extra explanation. So we're not creating sets of directions or procedures that aren't sufficient. They're not clear, and finally, they're not accessible. So what we're trying to do in when it comes to technical and professional writing is really being thoughtful, being mindful of all audiences, right? And making sure that everyone has access to information on a with equity, right? So we really want to start thinking about this now. With the case of tic tac toe, I don't want to get too uh, derailed by this because it is pretty straightforward. But how might we think about tic tac toe for, say, the visually impaired, for example? Right. This is not some. This is something that we would think of in a longer version of this, in a typical like long workshop or class situation where we have a little bit more time to spend. We would deconstruct this and start to change things and see, okay, how can we make tic tac toe more accommodating? What sort of system would we have to introduce to make this more accommodating? This is how we identify those areas that need to be filled for our communications to be equitable, right? But we're not going to worry. We're always worried about that, to be honest, but we're not going to focus on that right now. But we will start with, okay, we're going to start with our process map, right? And excuse me, the ideal situation for this too, what I like to do is bust out the post-it notes and start to, especially if you're working in a group, start laying this out on a surface where everyone can start to manipulate things and adjust them. But for our purposes, let's say that we're putting a piece together for a presentation. I'm going to start by using my rounded square. This is usually our start. Okay. I'm going to believe the conventional approach. And I really I missed Microsoft Visio. It was one of those pieces of software that you used to get with Office. And it was like, what is this strange thing? But I can create all sorts of cool technical diagrams with this. It's neat. All right. So here we've got our start box, typically a rounded rectangle. All right. And then, so I've added a arrow pointing to the step one. Okay. Now let's see if I've got this. Watch it turn out that I don't have. Looking for triangle. I've also seen ovals, which makes a lot of sense to me because ovals don't look a lot like these rectangles. So rectangles are essentially process. Like, okay, these are the steps, right? So what did I say? Draw two horizontal lines. Okay. It's a little bit bigger. Another nice thing about this is you start to run out of space really fast. Let's go ahead and rotate this. All right. Mm-mm-mm. This is actually one of my favorite parts. Copy and paste this. Now, again, this does seem like kind of a silly activity, but again, when you're taking tic tac toe is one thing, but when you're taking a more complex system like putting together a computer or building an IKEA cabinet, these start to get a little bit more complicated, right? IKEA instructions, for example, are notorious for being bad, right? So draw 3x3 grid. Right. Already running out of space here. So I'm going to, nice thing about PowerPoint is that you can extend this. And again, this is not the ideal tool to use either, but we're using these tools because this is what we have on campus. Right? And let's see what we have for our shapes. I believe object is a skewed trapezoid like this. Got all right. So we've got our basic 3x3 grid. And now we start to get into some more interesting pieces, right? So we're gonna fact, this is going to get even more complicated because I'm going to add, let's see, diamond. There we go. We're going to add a decision. So here, we might have to figure out how to determine which player goes first. Okay. So then we start to get into some more interesting questions, right? So how do first we then we have to determine who goes first, and that's usually by X. Okay. Right, and this is also where we start to look at this and go, this isn't quite right. Okay, that's good. This is all an effort to start to unpack all of the steps and details that are important if you're going to work with any given system. All right, so which player goes first, and then I might say, go. Okay, so we got that. And then we start to get into these pretty wild looking. Oops. That's cool. Did not realize that when you place the arrows. Again, this is going to start to look pretty lousy, but um, all right. And then you might start to talk about strategy a little bit. All right. So this is a pretty simple approach to process mapping. We've got here is again, so we started off with storyboarding, and again, thinking about if you're the more complicated system, storyboarding may not be feasible, but at least for something simple, it's helpful to start sketching it out. At least I feel like it's helpful to sketch any sort of complex process out a little bit. It just helps me visualize things a little bit more. Then we've got do a short list, just cranking out the list of components, the list of steps, any sort of questions that come up along the way. I'm going to highlight those because those are going to turn into my frequently asked questions. So let's say I'm going through this process. Hey, player X, second player. Now here's the first question: is who selects the first? Who's how do we determine who the first player is? So I might say something like a little bit here saying. Um, The other thing we haven't really talked about yet is the making sure that our writing is effective. So for now, I'm going to resist the urge to edit, and I'm going to just keep putting it out there. I might just write that now. A little bit of information here, just to add to it, start addressing some questions, but I might also supplement that with a frequently asked questions later on. All right, so this is a sort of a quick overview of um, some basic process mapping, storyboarding, and as we get towards technical writing, start to identify a lot of those details that we often overlook when as the experts were communicating information to an audience, especially those audiences who do not have that expert information or background. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn her off to the next appointment. My name is Chris Perzicki. I am an assistant professor of English and Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. This is Together We Write, a weekly live stream of writing how-tos, walkthroughs, whatever you want to call them. Each subject is determined by, for now, what I'm actually teaching on campus, but also looking for how other writing is happening on campus and elsewhere. If you have any questions or would like to see something discussed, please send me an email at my campus email, which can be found on the interwebs. This live stream is put together in no small part thanks to our incredible Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning and the Teaching Enhancement Grant that they provided for the purchasing of the equipment used to make this live stream. So feel free to thank them or not thank them for the production of this. You can blame them for the production of this live stream. All right. Anyway, have a great week. It's a beautiful day outside, still in the 70s, early November.